What happens when AI agents don't just think, but actually buy, sell, and trade with each other in their own economy? Google just unveiled something called the AI Agent Bazaar, built on their new MCP protocol X402, and it's basically a sandbox where AIs can pass not just context, but money. And thanks to Coinbase's new stablecoin, those transactions are nearly instant and nearly free. Think about that for a second. We've always used money as a success signal in human economies. Prices tell us what works, what's efficient, and what creates real value. Now, for the first time, AI agents can follow those same signals at machine speed without humans in the loop. This could be the moment where AI stops being a tool and starts becoming an economic actor. And if that doesn't blow your mind, it should. So let's take a look. Hey y'all, it's Dr. Know-It-All. I want to start off by reading the abstract from Google DeepMind's recent paper dated the 12th of September, so just about a week ago as I record this, about virtual agent economies. I'm just going to read the abstract. The paper itself is a beast. It's about 25 pages long. It's a huge paper. I will leave a link to it in the description so you can check it out if you're interested in reading the whole thing. I highly recommend it, but it's way too much to go into. But really what I want to do is use this as a jumping off point to talk about economic theory and how cheap, stable, and fast transactions could allow AI agents to become an AI economy, and of course what sort of consequences there will be for us humans. So let's start with this abstract from Google DeepMind. You can see it's Tomasev et al. Virtual Agent Economies, a nice short title. The rapid adoption of autonomous AI agents is giving rise to a new economic layer where agents transact and coordinate at scales and speeds beyond direct human oversight. In other words, they just work so much faster than humans can and at such a large scale that human oversight is basically impossible already, and over the next months and years it will become completely impossible just because it will be happening so quickly and at such a large scale. The authors continue, we propose the quote sandbox economy as a framework for analyzing this emergent system. So in other words, they're sandboxing it, they're allowing it to work, but not, releasing it into the wider world just yet, which probably is a good idea. Anyway, they propose the sandbox economy as a framework for analyzing this emergent system, characterizing it along two key dimensions: its origins, emergent versus intentional. In other words, does it just come out of the complexity of life, or is it created on purpose by humans? And its degree of separateness from the established human economy. In other words, permeable versus impermeable, or very associated with the human economy versus very impermeable or dissociated from the human economy. Our current trajectory points towards a spontaneous emergence of a vast and highly permeable AI agent economy, presenting us with opportunities for an unprecedented degree of coordination as well as significant challenges, very much, including systemic economic risk and exacerbated inequality. Here we discuss a number of possible design choices that may lead to safely steerable AI agent markets. In particular, we consider auction mechanisms for fair resource allocation and preference resolution, the design of AI, quote, mission economies to coordinate around achieving collective goals rather than individualistic, and socio-technical infrastructure needed to ensure trust, safety, and accountability. By doing this, we argue for the proactive design of steerable agent markets to ensure the coming technological shift aligns with humanity's long-term collective flourishing. So the whole second half of the abstract is actually about the danger of the have and have not economy becoming exacerbated. That's basically what they're talking about here, and how you steer away from that. I'm going to touch on that in this video. If you want a full video about the have and have nots and all of that, I will be happy to do it. Let me know in the comments. But in this video, I want to set out what it means to have an economy, at least one theory about that, about signaling success, and how a virtualized agentic economy could both replicate the human economy and also scale way beyond the human economy because of the speed at which all of this can happen. So the first thing to discuss is economic theory in general, and specifically the Austrian school of thought about economics, as promoted most by Hayek and von Mises. I am not an economist, but I have studied this stuff, at least in a general sense. The basic idea of this theory, and I'm being very simplified here, is that prices act as a decentralized knowledge base, which provides a success signal. In other words, can you charge $10 for your widget, or can you only charge $5, or do you have to give it away? Are people not interested? In a perfectly capitalistic system with perfect knowledge, that price, whatever it is that you're charging for your widget, will find a stable point between supply and demand. If you've ever taken basic economic theory, of course, you get the supply and demand curves. Where they cross is the value that society gives to whatever that particular widget is. And of course, this economic theory really promotes capitalism, basically pure capitalism, which nobody really actually practices. There are tariffs, there are protectionist schemes, there are large companies that try monopolistic behavior and things, and of course, the consumer is generally not perfectly knowledgeable about all of the products. So none of this works perfectly, but even in an imperfect world, it shows why capitalism tends to work better than things like communism or fascism, because in those systems, the success signal, which is the money that you can charge for whatever widget you're creating, becomes dissociated from the actual demand for it. So in other words, you could be waiting in line for bread or something for days, but no one is allowed to increase the cost of bread because the communist or fascist system has set the price of bread. And so therefore the signal for success, in other words, how much can I charge for this loaf of bread, gets dissociated from the actual demand, and you have serious problems. So in this theory, at least, which is what the authors of this Google DeepMind article are, purporting or working with, having this decentralized economic signal point to how much something is worth, and therefore how much work you should put into creating it, is the implicit theory that they are working with in this paper. And in my mind, at least, it's a pretty good theory. The other half of this is that you have to remove the friction of actually doing economic transactions. So in other words, if I had to go dig some gold out of the ground and collect it and break it up into small pieces, and then I wanted to buy something from a company in Billings, Montana, for example, and I had to drive all the way to Billings, Montana to hand them these pieces of gold to get whatever it is and then drive back home again, that is a lot of friction. That is traditional type of trade. And there's a lot of friction. There's a lot of time friction. There's a lot of travel friction. What I might do instead of traveling myself is have a person that I would hopefully trust to go transport this gold over and gather the items that I purchased for that and bring it back to me. So that involves middlemen and everything, and that creates a financial friction. So if we can lower that friction, if we can lower the time friction, especially for virtualized AI agents that can communicate at the speed of light, basically, so they can be talking really, really fast. If we can reduce that time friction and also reduce the cost friction, then we're talking about an economy that can scale up very, very rapidly. And of course, that's what's happened in the human world as well. We went from this sort of like pack mule kind of thing of transferring pieces of gold for actual items back and forth over long distances to bits of information being transmitted online back and forth between banks all around the world at the speed of light. So basically instantaneously. So there's been a lot of reduced friction in terms of time, and there's been a decent amount of reduced friction in terms of cost, but things like Visa, MasterCard, your banks, etc., they take reasonable chunks of money for doing these transactions, which is another problem. If everybody is charging 3 or 4% per transaction, you can't do massive amounts of ultra high-speed microtransactions without the money just disappearing. Consider it sort of an entropic heat. If you think about money as entropic, you've got a centralized chunk of money that you own, right? That's got low entropy. If you start doing these trades back and forth and there is time and financial friction, that effectively creates financial heat. And what you're doing is lowering the entropy of the money that you have. So from my dollar that I have, every time I do a transaction, 3 or 4% of that just goes away to heat, to economic heat. And therefore the entropy of my money is increased. In other words, it goes out into the world. So the entropy of my money is increased because it goes out into the world in the form of that sort of economic heat. And the amount of money that I have left goes down and down and down. So ideally what you want is ultra fast and ultra cheap types of transactions that can happen. And this is where Google DeepMind's proposed Agent Bazaar, their X402 evolution of the MCP protocol that was created by Anthropic, and Coinbase's stablecoin come into play. The AI Agent Bazaar and the X402 protocol allow agents to talk to each other with very high degree of knowledge. In other words, they know what's going on. They know each other, at least ideally. So that creates that perfect economic condition. And then when they want to make a microtransaction, in other words, they've decided that you're going to go off and do this for me. It's going to be in the virtual world at first, at least, right? It's going to be no real things, but you can go off and do some sort of software task that I need you to do, and I'm going to pay you, a half a penny or something like that. When you've made that decision in the bazaar, which can actually be done through auction, in other words, I could have 5 different companies bidding on this, and they can say what they can do for how much. When I, as the client, decide that and decide I'm going to pay them, then I would make use of the Coinbase stablecoin, which has a very, very low transaction fee. So even if I'm only doing transactions at, fractions of a penny, I can still afford to do that, which I could not afford to do with traditional banks or credit cards or the like. So what does the X402 AI Agent Bazaar give us? Well, it emphasizes that capitalistic money as a success metric because you're able to do auctions. You have hopefully perfect knowledge being passed back and forth at light speed between these agents, and that therefore reveals optimal paths for these agents to follow and also encourages specialization. In other words, as an agent that provides a service for somebody, maybe what I can can do is I can specialize on one very, very specific task. Like maybe if there were a bunch of AI venture capitalists, virtual agents out there, I could create an agent that would do due diligence for them financially. So I could go and look at the records of a company and see how their financial health is and return that information back to these VC agents. That would be a specialized activity that I could do, that my agent could do, not me. That would then be of value to these VC agents. And then what would happen would be over time, if these VC agents invested in these companies and it turned out that I was doing a really bad job and these companies actually did not have good economic health when I said that they did, then the value of what I provides would go down. Whereas if I was successful and these companies were able to invest in companies that had good economic health because I did good due diligence, then the value of what I provide would go up. People would find out about that in the bazaar and I would be able to charge more money for my services. So that's the basic idea of this. Again, it's just a direct transfer from the way humans work to this world. And what that allows is a diffusion of speed and scale. In other words, you can have hundreds or thousands of these agents that can be running billions of experiments in parallel, far beyond human coordination, but basically the same thing the human economy has been doing for thousands of years, just much more rapidly and with many more agents than have ever existed in the human world. And of course, as a note, this is why the authors have put these agents into a sandbox environment. You can just imagine if they just release them into the economic world at large, that they could run amok and cause all kinds of problems. So in my mind, at least, it's a really good thing that they've put them in a sandbox for now, and that might remain. You might have a kind of parallel economy that's going on with these agents, and you can sort of transfer money back and forth between the human economy and the sandbox economy once in a while, but that for the most part, this virtual agentic world stays parallel and separate from the human economy. At least for the near term, I would consider that a really good idea from a security standpoint. So Coinbase comes into the picture here because they've created a new, quote, very stable coin, which is designed to be low cost, fast transaction layer that can do microtransactions really, really quickly and is stable because it's based on the US dollar rather than fluctuating wildly like a lot of these speculative cryptocurrencies. And therefore it provides a stability because that means that the economic value of the coin is not going up and down in seconds. And you could see where that would be really bad if it was not stable. Like what I could do is I could purchase something from another company. I could say, hey, I'll pay you one stable coin, right? Just arbitrarily. I'll pay you one of these coins to go off and do this thing. Well, if the value of that coin changes by 50% up or down, by the time the virtual agent comes back and returns whatever it is that I requested, that makes the value of what they did extremely unstable. They could get very much more or less money than they deserve. So having a stable coin is pretty critical for this. But beyond that, you want very, very frictionless, very fast, very cheap microtransactions that could be possible at scale. So you can be doing things for, on the order of a penny or less per transaction, bulking them up together like the Bitcoin Lightning Network and using the blockchain to verify the veracity of these transactions. So you can see Google taking the lead here, trying to be the first mover to enable a true economic marketplace for AI agents, which will allow them, this is a big deal, it'll allow them for the first time to not just think and do stuff virtually, but also manage finances independently. In other words, create their own economy. And that's where we might truly see these agents grow into their own. And of course, the ripple effects of this will be massive if it works. And I think when it works, this seems like a fantastic idea to me. It's one of those things, if you have ideas on how to create some of these virtual agents, I'm brainstorming ideas for what you can create these agents to do. But I think people getting in early on this and creating these agents are going to stand to make a lot of money. You could do business automation, AI supply chains, and of course, agent-to-agent service markets. All of that is going to explode, I think, given the AI agent bazaar and the stablecoin. Now, I don't want to touch too much on the wider economic ramifications of this in this particular video, but I think you can see very clearly that this could generate relatively few haves. In other words, people who start creating these agents, and of course the folks who create the marketplace themselves, in other words, Google, and a lot of have-nots, people who get cut out of the economy because this virtualized sandboxed economy grows bigger and bigger and bigger and takes over the economic value of humans, which of course puts humans out of work and creates all sorts of individual and societal problems. So there's a lot of upside to this. I think it's really cool, and I think it's actually pretty inevitable because it seems seems like the right thing to do, but at the same time, there are massive economic and societal challenges that are going to grow out of this. So we need to tread very, very carefully, which is why, again, half of the abstract in the article is about taking care about the economic and societal ripple effects that will happen from this agent-to-agent marketplace. So here's the big picture. With the AI agent bazaar, the X402 evolution of the MCP protocol, and Coinbase's stablecoin, Google just gave AI agents something they've never had before: true economic autonomy. For centuries, money has been humanity's most powerful coordination tool, and now we're handing that same tool to machines. The question is, does this unlock a new wave of efficiency and innovation, or are we building an economy we won't be able to control? Or quite possibly both at the same time. I'd of course love to hear what you think about all of this in the comments. Is this the smartest idea Google's ever had, or the most dangerous? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and while you're down there, if you hit that like button, it helps other people to find this video. And of course, consider subscribing for more of this kind of content, and I will see you in the next video. Bye-bye.